Hello, and welcome to the channel. In the early hours of New Year's Day 1981, police at St. Paul, Minnesota received a disturbing phone call from a man who was pleading with them to send help to Pierce Butler Road, where at Malmberg Manufacturing Company, he claimed that a girl was hurt.
Police station.
Yes, please, this is an emergency. Please send a squad to Pierce Butler Road, Malmberg Manufacturing Company, machine shop. Please, there's an ambulance too. There's a girl hurt there.
Can you tell me what happened to her?
Just hurry, she's laying on the ground in the back by the railroad tracks, by the airfield. Hurry.
What's the address?
I don't know.
Who are you? Hello?
Police and ambulance services would rush to the scene, where they would soon find the victim lying face down in the snow. She had been stripped of her clothes and beaten over the head with a tire iron, to the extent that part of her brain had been exposed. The violence inflicted on the victim was evident, as buttons from her blouse had been found 50 to 60 feet from where she laid, after being torn off of her. Despite her traumatic injuries, the woman was still alive. She was rushed to a nearby hospital where she underwent emergency surgery, and thankfully, the woman, who was now identified as 20-year-old Karen Potak, would survive the surgery. Investigators learned that Karen was out that night celebrating New Year's Eve with her sisters. At around 1 AM, they realised that Karen was no longer in the nightclub that they had been partying in. After waiting some time, just in case she returned, they eventually made their way back home. It turned out that about an hour prior, a drunken Karen decided that she would make her way home. The weather that night was unsurprisingly cold and Karen had no coat, but as she only lived a short distance from the nightclub, she opted to make the trip home regardless. While walking home, a car pulled up alongside her. A male driver opened the passenger side door, handed Karen his coat, and offered her a ride home. Tempted by the warmth, Karen agreed and got inside. The driver then pulled away into the night. Unfortunately for Karen, the driver would instead take her to a remote section of Pierce Butler Road, where he would force her out of the car and commence his savage attack. Sadly, because of the trauma to Karen's brain, she was unable to recall any details of her ordeal, and as such, she was unable to provide police with a description of her attacker. Frustratingly, police were also unable to recover any forensic evidence at the crime scene. With no witnesses, no clues, and no possible leads, the case would quickly go cold. And unfortunately, just 5 months later, another young woman would be violently attacked. And unlike Karen Potak, she would be less fortunate. It's now the 3rd of June 1981. 3 young boys were playing near a stretch of an incomplete freeway at St. Paul, where they would get the shock of their lives, stumbling upon the partially dressed body of a young woman, discarded among some nearby bushes. They would immediately call 911 to report their discovery. Around 30 minutes later, St. Paul police would receive an anonymous phone call.
Will you find me? I just stabbed somebody with an ice pick. I can't stop myself. I keep killing somebody else.
When they arrived at the scene, investigators quickly learned that the young woman had suffered severe injuries to her chest, stomach, and inner thighs. A medical examination would later reveal that she had been choked with a set of shoelaces. Although this wouldn't be what caused the young woman's death, but rather the 61 stab wounds inflicted on the victim, caused by the killer using an ice pick. Further examinations would thankfully reveal no signs of sexual assault, and that her final meal was beef and fries. Investigators would quickly identify the victim as 18-year-old Kimberly Compton, thanks to a key they found on her person. The key belonged to a nearby Greyhound bus locker located on St. Peter Street. The key, which opened locker 750, contained 2 bags which contained Kimberly's possessions, such as books and her personal identification. Kimberly's cousin Earl McDonough, who had the unfortunate task of identifying Kimberly, would describe her as a very friendly, outgoing person who was easy to get along with and a very trusting young woman. Detectives investigating the homicide would discover that Kimberly Compton had recently graduated from high school and boarded a Greyhound bus from Wisconsin to St. Paul only a few hours before she was found. She was hoping to find work in the city and start a new life in St. Paul, only to have her dreams cut short within hours of boarding the Greyhound bus. Detectives would also find out that the last meal she had, beef and fries, was a special being served on the day of her murder at a local Mickey's diner. When they spoke with staff there, they confirmed that Kimberly had been in the diner that day, eating alone. However, as she was enjoying her meal, a much older gentleman was sitting on his own a few tables away and noticed Kimberly. He got out from his table and shuffled up alongside Kimberly, where the pair struck up a conversation. Kimberly seemed quite comfortable talking to the man, and when she revealed that she was new to the city, he offered to take her around town to show her the sights the city had to offer. Kimberly agreed, and the two left the diner together. The next time Kimberly would be seen, she would be dead. On the 5th of June, 2 days after Kimberly was discovered, the same man would call back, dramatically professing his remorse for the killing of Kimberly. He would call back again the following day to complain that certain pieces of information that had been published by the media were incorrect, followed by another call on the 11th of June.
Don't talk, just listen. I'm sorry what I did to Compton. I couldn't help it. Don't know why I had to stab her. I am so upset about it. I keep getting drunk every night. I can't believe I just a big dream. I can't think of being locked up. If I get locked up, I'll kill myself. I'd rather kill myself than get locked up. I'll try not to kill anybody else.
This time, police were able to trace this call back to a bus depot phone booth and sent units to the location in the hope that they would catch the culprit. However, luck wasn't on their side, as by the time they arrived, he was long gone. Additionally, police were unable to extract a clear set of fingerprints. They would closely watch the phone booth over the next few days, hoping to catch the killer making one of his notorious calls. Sadly though, he failed to show, closing off yet another door to a possible lead. Authorities then turned their attention to looking for any other calls that had previously been made that matched the voice calling in about the Kimberly Compton murder. They searched through calls linked to unsolved cases, where they eventually discovered the 911 call made on New Year's Day relating to Karen Potak's attack. St. Paul police now realised that they had a serial attacker on their hands. In a bid to get people to come forward with information, police would release segments of the calls to the public, praying that someone would recognise the voice. Initially, it seemed as though this idea may have worked, as there would be approximately 150 calls received from members of the public, claiming to know the identity of the caller. However, as each name was explored and ruled out, investigators would be right back to where they had started. But just when all hope seemed lost, around 2 months later, a seemingly unrelated event would quickly give police what they were looking for: a suspect. In August 1981, St. Paul police were called to a residential address where a man had barricaded himself in his home along with his mother, father and sister. The man, later identified as Alan Lopez, was threatening to kill his family. Initially, police were resistant to break their way into the home for fear of harm coming to the people inside, and so a standoff ensued. Police would make contact with Lopez by telephone and spend several hours trying to talk him down. However, during these negotiations, Alan Lopez dropped a bombshell on the authorities. He confessed to being responsible for the murder of Kimberly Compton. Moments after the confession, police breached the home and successfully apprehended Lopez. But tragically, it was apparent that Lopez's mother, father and sister had already been long dead since the siege began. Alan Lopez was subsequently arrested and charged with their murder. Now in police custody, investigators spared no time in trying to link Lopez to Compton's murder, as well as the near-fatal attack on Karen Potag. Digging into his background, they soon discovered that Alan Lopez had a violent past and had long suffered with mental illness. While it seemed like police were on the right track, their optimism was short-lived. For one, investigators had trouble placing Lopez at the scene of each crime at the time they took place. Additionally, they compared both the recordings of the phone conversations during the siege and the 911 calls that took place and determined that the voices didn't match. Still, that didn't stop investigators from continuing to look into the possibility of Lopez being what was now being dubbed in the media as the Weepy Voiced Killer. But the investigation would come to a grinding halt when on the 11th of February 1982, Alan Lopez would take his own life. While the evidence was shaky at best, police were growing quietly confident that Lopez may have actually been the killer. After all, since his arrest back in August, no more phone calls had been made to 911, and more importantly, no bodies matching the killer's MO had been discovered. That was until there was. On the 6th of August 1982, a paperboy was in the middle of doing his rounds on the Minneapolis side of the Mississippi River. As he was riding along the bank of the river, he noticed something which caught his eye. On the ground were a pair of glasses that had been randomly discarded. The young lad picked up the glasses and noticed that a little further from the specks was what he initially believed to be a discarded dummy. Intrigued by the discovery, the paperboy began to etch closer, but with each step, he grew more uncomfortable. Something wasn't quite right. When he was right next to his discovery, he knelt down and touched the feet of the dummy. Only it wasn't a dummy. It was the lifeless body of a woman. Realizing the horrific scene he stumbled across, the paperboy rushed off to call 911. Moments later, police had cordoned off the area and began their investigation. It was immediately apparent that the woman had sustained a severe beating, as well as over 100 stab wounds that were found all over her body. What was worrying for police, however, was that the puncture wounds were circular-shaped, indicating that the choice of weapon may have been a Phillips screwdriver or even an ice pick. Based on the crime scene, it was evident that the victim had been dragged to her final resting place, which suggested that whoever killed her did not want her to be found. Detective Don Brown, who was leading the investigation, believed that had the killer been inexperienced, or if it was a crime of passion, then chances were that they wouldn't have made an attempt to hide the victim. Therefore, the detective concluded that the person responsible had likely killed before. When authorities attempted to locate identification that would reveal the identity of their Jane Doe, they found nothing. While working tirelessly to figure out the woman's identity, police would also review case files of unsolved crimes, checking for any similarities. However, just 2 days later, on the 8th of August, police would receive a call that would laser focus their investigation.
Fire emergency.
Please don't talk, just listen. I'm sorry I killed that girl. I stabbed her 40 times. Kimberly Compton was the first one. Oh, my chief. I don't know what's the matter with me. I'm sick. I'm going to kill myself, I think.
Where are you?
I'm just going to... If somebody dies with a red shirt on, it's me. I killed both of you. I'm sorry. I'll never make it to heaven.
Calm down.
It was now evident that the Weepy Voiced Killer was definitely not Alan Lopez, and that the real killer had come out of the shadows after a whole year. Desperate not to let this case slip from their fingers, investigators recruited help from the FBI to carry out a profile of the attacker. They speculated that he may be someone who experiences personality disorders, as demonstrated by the calls themselves. They compared the stark contrast between the nature of his violent crimes and the supposed regret expressed on the telephone when confessing his crimes to police, suggesting that possible past trauma may have shaped his actions. Still, it was uncommon for serial killers to openly confess their crimes, which brought into question the killer's motivations behind the phone calls. While it was possible the remorse was genuine, it was also equally possible that he was playing a cat and mouse game with police, behaving almost childlike. Also around this time, detectives had placed unmarked officers around the city, hoping to find someone whose voice could match the weeping mannerisms that had haunted them for over a year and a half now. But one day, while a mailman was out collecting post from the Minneapolis mailboxes, he'd stumble across a purse that had been stuffed inside. The mailbox was located near the same Greyhound bus terminal that Kimberly Compton had been that fateful day in June of last year. The postal worker would hand over the item to police, and when they checked its contents, they found identification that matched their Jane Doe. They had now identified their victim, 40-year-old Barbara Simons. She was a nurse who resided in South Minneapolis and was described by those close to her as a laid-back, nice and caring woman. She was well known in her neighbourhood and had no trouble getting along with others. Police would break the devastating news to her family and get to work retracing her steps. They would learn that on the night of her murder, she visited a nearby bar called the Hexagon Bar. Popular for its cheap drinks, live music and laid-back atmosphere, detectives spoke with the staff there. One of the waitresses recognised Barbara there with a muscular white man around 6 foot tall and sporting a moustache. That same man was also seen by one of the male bartenders side-eyeing the worker throughout the evening. During the night, the waitress who noticed the man was approached by Barbara towards the end of the night, saying to the staff member something to the effect of, "He's cute. I hope he's nice, since he's giving me a ride home." It was this statement that made the waitress take notice of the man more carefully. Unfortunately, this was the last time anyone saw Barbara alive. With this crucial information, police got to work scouring through mugshots of men who fit the description the Hexagon Bar staff gave them. After whittling down their potential suspects, they returned to the Hexagon Bar in the hopes that their suspect was on their shortlist. And much to their relief, the staff were able to pick one man from the list. For the first time since Alan Lopez's false confession, detectives now had a suspect: Paul Michael Stephani. With Stephani top of the investigator suspect list, police set up 24-hour, round-the-clock surveillance on him, monitoring his each and every move, hoping to catch him slip up. However, on the 21st of August 1982, officers staking out his residence witnessed Stephani leave his apartment and enter his car. The officers proceeded to follow Stephani into Minneapolis, but after a while, Stephani had somehow managed to give them the slip. It's not known whether Stephani was aware he was being tailed, or if the men responsible for tracking Stephani had just messed up. But what is certain is that had they kept him in their sights, the following would likely never have happened. Several hours after losing police, 19-year-old sex worker Denise Williams was walking down Hennepin Avenue, Minneapolis, when she saw Stephani pull up beside her in his car. Stephani offered Denise $100 to, quote, "have some fun." The only problem was that he didn't have all of the money available up front. He suggested paying $40 now and $60 upon completion of her services. Denise would agree, getting into his car. The two drove back to Stephani's home, went inside, and after a minute or so, Stephani was finished. He kept his word and paid Denise the outstanding $60 and offered to take her back to downtown Minneapolis. Seeing no reason to reject the offer, Denise accepted his request, and together, they made their way downtown. Denise, who had been a sex worker since she was just 13 years old, understood her surroundings very well. During the journey, Denise noticed that Stephani was driving through several back roads. When she challenged Stephani, he dismissed her concerns, assuring her that he was taking a shortcut. Further into the journey, Stephani's demeanour changed, and he began telling Denise about his sexual desires. It was understandably creeping Denise out, so she began subtly scanning the interior of the car, looking for a potential weapon should things go south. She asked again where they were going, to which Stephani responded by saying Hennepin Avenue. But after driving for another 2 blocks, the pair would end up at a dead-end parking lot near East Hennepin and Coolidge Avenue. Stephani turned off the engine, turned to Denise, and said, "Ass, grass or gas. No one rides for free." Stephani then launched at Denise with a Phillips screwdriver, stabbing her in the stomach. Denise frantically struggled to get out of the car, but Stephani was unrelenting in his attack. Denise fell back to her seat, fighting back while recalling the empty glass Coke bottle when she was scanning the car earlier. Struggling for her life, she managed to reach for the bottle, and in one fell swoop, she struck Stephani over the face, busting his cheek, head, nose and hand. Despite the blood pouring out of Stephani onto Denise's face, she continued to scratch, bite and kick, all while he continued to stab her. Stephani eventually opened the passenger door, causing the pair to both fall out of the car. Stephani, however, was on top and still continuing his attack. Denise's screams of I'm dying," would be heard by a nearby resident, Douglas Panning. Douglas followed the screams to the parking lot, where he'd see blood on the pavement and disturbingly witnessed Stephani stab Denise a further 5 to 6 times. Douglas would later say that he could hear the Phillips screwdriver thud with each thrust of the tool. He would attempt to help Denise, grabbing Stephani by his left arm, but Stephani would quickly turn his attention to Douglas, swinging at him manically with the screwdriver. Stephani would then chase Douglas to the end of the car park. Douglas retreated back to his home to call the police. Stephani, sensing that authorities were being called, stopped his attack, got back into his car and raced off into the night, leaving Denise Williams bleeding out in the car park. Douglas then returned to Denise to help her until emergency services arrived. She would be raced to hospital and undergo emergency surgery to treat 15 stab wounds around her lower right chest, upper right abdomen and the right side of her head. She also sustained a punctured lung and liver. Denise Williams would thankfully survive her ordeal. While she would tell police her name was Mary Gross, out of fear of police learning about her line of work, after a few days she would reveal her real name and provide an accurate account as to what happened that late August evening. That said, she would immediately describe the injuries she inflicted upon Stephani right from the outset. But a short time after Denise Williams was raced to hospital, the police would receive a 911 call from a familiar voice, but this time, he wasn't calling to confess.
Need an ambulance?
Where?
1505 Westminster?
1505
Yes.
Westminster, what's the problem?
I'm all cut up. I got beat up.
What's your apartment number?
208. I'm bleeding.
208, where are you bleeding from?
From my arm, my face, my head.
When Stephani returned home, presumably the adrenaline dump he had worn off. Noticing his own injuries courtesy of Denise Williams, he called 911, claiming to be the victim of an attack and that he required help. However, dispatchers were already aware of the situation with Denise Williams, and once Stephani called in, not even attempting to disguise his own voice, it wasn't hard for the dispatchers to put 2 and 2 together. An ambulance was sent to Stephani's apartment, where he would be taken to hospital for treatment, but as soon as his injuries were tended to, police were there ready to take him in for questioning. When Stephani was interrogated, investigators initially went along with his version of events. However, when Detective Don Brown, the lead investigator of the Weepy Voiced Killer case, brought in the case file of the previous murders, including crime scene images, Stephani was said to have jumped up from his seat and said to his interrogators, "You're not going to pin those on me." But when he did so, he said it in a high-pitched tone, similar to that of his numerous phone calls. As soon as Detective Brown heard the way he protested, he knew he had his man. So who exactly was Paul Michael Stephani? Born on the 8th of September 1944 in Austin, Mower County, Minnesota, He was the second born of 10 children in the family household. His parents, Father Isidore and Mother Madeline, were divorced not long after he was born, with his mother remarrying when he was 3 years old. While Stephani grew up in a Catholic home, his stepfather was reportedly abusive, going as far as to push the children down the stairs should he get angry enough. The household he lived in was considered by post-World War II standards to be modest and working class. Stephani would attend Catholic schools in Austin, where he was said to have struggled both academically and socially, particularly in his teenage years, where it was said he experienced anger management issues and struggled to form close relationships with both his peers and the opposite sex. Stephani would eventually drop out of high school before graduating. He would move to St. Paul from Austin in the 1960s, where he would go on to work a number of low-skilled jobs over the years. However, he consistently struggled to hold down work, leading to him bouncing from job to job. Interestingly, one job Stephani held in 1977 was a janitorial position at none other than Malmberg Manufacturing Company, the very same one where Karen Potak had been attacked. Stephani would blame his inability to maintain steady employment due to health issues, particularly epilepsy, that he alleged to have suffered at one of the companies he worked at. Despite his employment woes, Stephani was able to meet and marry a woman named Beverly Lyder. Not much is known about their marriage, except that shortly after the birth of their daughter, Beverly and Stephani separated, with the pair divorcing not long after. Stephani also met and entered into a relationship with a Syrian woman, but this relationship was also doomed to fail after she left him to return to Syria to enter into an arranged marriage. Reportedly, this devastated Stephani. The man dubbed the Weepy Voiced Killer had lived a life marked by failed relationships, isolation, and a series of low-paying jobs he couldn't hold on to, culminating in a violent spree of attacks and murders from 1981 to 1982. Paul Michael Stephani would be tried for the murder of Barbara Simons, the attempted murder of Denise Williams, and for second-degree assault on the attack of Douglas Panning. They decided against trying him for the attack on Karen Potak and the murder of Kimberly Compton, as authorities stated that there was a lack of physical evidence that they could use. One of the main talking points was of course the calls that Stephani made to police. The prosecution were hoping to use new voice analysis technology to strengthen their argument that the voice on the 911 calls belonged to Stephani. But due to the infancy of the technology, coupled with the fact that they were unable to conclusively link the calls back to him, as the so-called weepy voice calls were considered too distorted and emotional, their request was denied. While this was a setback, the calls would be played to Paul Stephani's sister, who reportedly bowed her head and confirmed that the voice matched that of her brother. Furthermore, the calls would also be played back to his ex-wife, who would also verify that they belonged to Stephani. Despite it being inconclusive, the fact that two people close to Stephani agreed he was the voice behind the calls, it carried significant weight with the jury. Forensic experts also played a supporting role, confirming blood samples found in Stephani's car matched Denise Williams' blood type, as well as demonstrating the links behind the choice of weapon used for each attack. Denise Williams would also provide testimony at the trial, going into harrowing detail about her ordeal that fateful August night. Paul Michael Stephani would be found guilty for the murder of Barbara Simons and the attempted murder of Denise Williams. He was sentenced to 40 years for Barbara's murder, plus an additional 18 years for the attempted murder of Denise, and was sent to the Oak Park Heights prison in Minnesota, the state's highest security prison, which houses some of the state's most violent offenders. Stephani would appeal the decision, and in 1985, his request would be dismissed by the Court of Appeals in Minnesota. Following his imprisonment, the Weepy Voiced Killer would slowly fade into the back of the minds of the residents of Minnesota. But in 1997, Stephani reached out to authorities with a proposition. In exchange for a picture of his late mother's gravestone, he would provide them with a full confession. Police quickly agreed, and upon locating and taking a picture of the gravestone and handing this to Stephani, he held up his end of the bargain. As for why he was willing to speak up after years of silence and denial, Stephani had been diagnosed with terminal skin cancer in 1997 and had been given less than a year to live. According to Stephani, he wanted to apologise to the victims' families and give them closure, as well as redeem himself in the eyes of God. Paul Michael Stephani would confess to the murder of Barbara Simons and attack on Denise Williams, as well as owning up to attacking Karen Potak and killing Kimberly Compton. Police ensured that Stephani went into as much detail as possible, and Stephani openly obliged, sharing details of the crimes that had not been released to the public. While detectives who spoke with Stephani were satisfied with his confession, he was not finished yet. In a shocking turn of events, he would confess to a further murder. While he was able to recall the layout of the house and the method in which he killed the woman, Stephani was no longer able to recall his victim's name. He told them that he drowned the woman in a bathtub, leading police to go back and review open cases involving freshwater deaths. After narrowing down the list of potential victims, they eventually found a name. 33-year-old schoolteacher Kathleen Greening from Lauderdale, Minnesota, was due to go on vacation with her best friend Carol Kellogg to Mackinac Island. They were scheduled to leave on the 21st of July 1982, but Carol became instantly concerned when Kathleen didn't show up for their planned departure. Worried for her friend, Carol travelled to Kathleen's home and found the front door was unlocked. She stepped inside and saw no signs of her friend inside the ground floor of the home, but as she searched upstairs, she would eventually make her way in the bathroom, where she would find Kathleen lifeless in her bath. Kathleen's death would ultimately be ruled inconclusive until Stephani's confession in 1997. He would later tell reporter Caroline Lowe, who interviewed him after his confession, that the two had been spending the evening together and were having a good time when he suddenly got the urge to put his hands around Kathleen's throat. He also told investigators during his confession that the pair had got into the bath together, at which point Stephani pushed Kathleen under the water by both her shoulders, drowning her. Naturally, this threw police, as the MO described was not typical of his other attacks, and unlike the others, he hadn't phoned 911. However, as authorities dug deeper, they reviewed an address book belonging to Kathleen that had been kept as evidence, where they found a phone number next to the name Paul S. It was Paul Stephani's phone number, confirming that Kathleen and Paul knew each other. Given that Stephani had less than a year to live, they decided against charging him with Kathleen's murder, but they would close the case down, satisfied now that Stephani was the man responsible. Chronologically, Kathleen was Stephani's second murder victim, making it 3 women in total that he killed, making him officially a serial killer. On the 12th of June 1998, Paul Michael Stephani died in the infirmary at Oak Park Heights Prison. He was 58 years of age. So what drove Paul Michael Stephani to carry out these crimes? The truth is, it's difficult to say. Stephani wasn't your typical serial killer. He was emotionally unstable and seemingly expressed guilt for the crimes he committed, as demonstrated by his 911 calls. Then again, there were times when he acted as though the act of murder was a natural act. He would say, quote, "Killing seemed to me, the thing you were supposed to do that was part of life. Driving a car was part of life. Eating food was part of life. To me it seemed like killing was part of life, until I did it." As well as this, he would also claim that there were voices in his head saying, quote, "Paul, it's time to kill." When it comes to his 911 calls, there are others who believe that Stephani was actually doing nothing more than mocking police, treating the situation as some kind of sick cat and mouse game. As for how he could be so nonchalant with the concept of killing, while simultaneously showing high levels of remorse, it's theorized that his deeply held religious roots had a role to play. Growing up in a deeply Catholic household, Stephani portrayed himself as a man who feared God's retribution, as demonstrated by his concerns about not making it to heaven. His violent nature, combined with the moral values he was taught, may have resulted in an internal conflict that plagued him throughout his life. Another theory that floated around was the fact that he was socially awkward and had experienced multiple rejections by women. Divorced by his wife, abandoned by his Syrian girlfriend, Stephani may have instead turned his frustrations towards a hatred of women. Interestingly, the colour red may have been a trigger for Stephani, as Karen Potag, Kimberly Compton and Barbara Simons were all wearing red when they were found. I've seen claims that there's a picture of Stephani and his Syrian girlfriend where she is seen to be wearing red, but I've not seen this picture, so I can't say for sure if this is the case. Regardless, when he was profiled by the FBI, they saw the connection and warned women against wearing red. As for what I think, I don't know. Researching this case has left me genuinely perplexed. Part of me thinks that Stephani may have been genuine in his remorse, perhaps even having some kind of personality disorder. However, I don't believe he was ever officially diagnosed, which leads me to believe, and I lean more towards this, that the remorse was insincere. I don't really believe he felt bad for his victims. I believe he was more concerned about his own well-being. The idea of not getting into heaven petrified Stephani, and he'd do anything to gain redemption. I hope that in the eyes of the Lord, he fell well short of that mark. One last thing. When Stephani was 13 years old, he was out with 3 of his brothers and friends at the Austin Country Club hunting for golf balls in Dobbins Creek. According to reports, Paul spotted a ball in the water and went to retrieve it, but when he was coming back, he was said to have blacked out and fell into the stream, only to be rescued by one of his brothers and 2 friends. He was actually the second of 2 people that same day who had been saved from potentially drowning. He was taken to hospital, but was said to have been in good condition and discharged shortly thereafter. To think, had things played out differently, 3 innocent women could have been spared, with a further 2 women's lives not being changed forever. Thank you for watching. If you're new here, subscribe to the channel. I'm aiming to get back to making more true crime content, and I already have a couple of video ideas I'm researching and writing, so be sure to turn on the notification bell. For my returning subscribers, I'm extremely grateful for your patience while I was away. Thank you. Until next time, take care and goodbye. For now.